we're going to stand here, and he's going to ask questions of me and ask me to clarify or challenge me on something. Or
Okay. Yeah, so you said that, and you showed us an example of the Samarkand Codex, which is a reasonably early Quranic manuscript, and you also put up a modern-day example of the Qur'an showing chapters 112 to 114. And on the Samarkand Codex, you said that it does show 112 and 114 and an extra 2. Can you give me a brief rundown of what the extra 2 say, if you're aware, and can you quote for me even one scholar that suggested that these 2 are actually chapters of the Qur'an, were considered even by a fringe group to be a chapter of the Qur'an, and when they disappeared? Because the Samarkand Codex obviously comes well after the Uthmanic recension.
Yep. Okay, now I never said that the Samarkand had those 2 extra surahs. The Samarkand manuscript is incomplete. It only has about a third. The differences between it and the modern Qur'an are available online, and so you can search that. It's on the Answering Islam website. Now, can I give evidence that it was taken by any fringe group? Well, it was. I think it's called the Ban Kippur manuscript is the other one, which has surahs 115 and 16. Obviously, there was some Islamic group that had them because they had them in their Qur'an. Whether or not they line up with the hadith in Bukhari about Ubay, I've forgotten his first name, but Ubay, it talks about him having 2 extra surahs in his Qur'an. And so he had a 116 surah Qur'an. Now, whether or not they correspond to that early one mentioned in Bukhari, I don't know. And the one also, because that's the same as Al-Nadim also mentions that in the 4th Islamic century when he's looking at the Qur'ans, and they've got different numbers in them. Now, I want to point you to those sources. I'm not familiar at reading their content, but obviously someone believed in it because they had them, and they're certainly mentioned in Bukhari and in other sources.
All right. I mean, in terms of the extras added by Ubay ibn Ka'b, we can probably speak about that in the discussion perhaps after the event. It'll take up a bit too much time here now. But I guess if if I were willing to entertain the idea that these additions were accepted by a fringe group, well then, if that's making then a reflection on the Qur'an as a collection, well then what do the Christian fringe groups' opinions on the codex the canon of the New Testament have on reflect upon the collection of the New Testament itself? So, for example, we've got Marcion, who you quoted, who didn't believe in the Jewish God. He clearly distinguished between the Jewish God and the God of Christ. He didn't believe in any of the Hebrew scriptures. We've got others as well that believe in all the Gnostic Gospels. So, if we're going to consider the opinions of fringe groups, if they indeed do exist, as being relevant, well then how does that also cross-apply to the Christian experience?
Fantastic, thank you. Yes, and that was my point. I guess what I've been trying to call for in this debate is for us not to exaggerate either way. What I'm saying is that Christians, yes, we have had questions about what the canon is, and there were a number of books where we had to do the investigation and come to a decision. But what I'm saying is that there were similar discussions with the Qur'an, and there just were. There were some Qur'ans had 110, some had 116. They had to work it out. Now, I'm trusting that the Muslims worked it out to their satisfaction, and I'm convinced that the Christians worked it out to their satisfaction as well. I'm just asking that we don't exaggerate either way.
All right. Another thing that you said was that the consonantal markers and the short vowels don't matter. Now, how do you feel about the cross example I gave in terms of classical Hebrew not having consonantal markers for the fa and the pa and the kha and the ka? And also not having short vowels until, the Masoretic recension 1,000 years after Christ. I mean, how does that correlate to, a Christian understanding of even the Old Testament? Also, how does your opinion hold up to the fact that Muslims were commentating on the Qur'an at least 100 years before these vowel markers were introduced into Arabic?
Okay, heaps of questions. I'll just finish this question. Great question there. Let's hope I can remember it all. It's gone from my head. I fully accept that the Old Testament is similar as a Semitic language, and so has those uncertainties at points as well. So I accept that. And so that's why I'm calling for us not to exaggerate, but to look at the evidence before us and not just say absolute perfection, complete corruption. So I accept that, and so we've got to do that. That being said, though, I don't think I said that the text couldn't be read. Certainly when you read those commentators, they would read it, but even when they read it, very often, like Tabari, in his commentaries, he will put forward where the dots could go and give a few different options. So even in his commentaries, it's not just you can read it obviously, he has to vocalise the text first. And so there are some readings that he accepts, other readings that he accepts. I mentioned the 10 different accepted readings that I put up before. There are actually a whole range of other ones which are rejected. And so not all readings are accepted. So there were people who had been reciting a particular reading which then was deemed not worthy and they couldn't use it. They had to use one of the 10. So I agree that it's there with the Hebrew as well. The Arabic text, yes, it's basic, but it still did need that process. I'm not saying that people couldn't do it, but when they did it, they had to put something there, and the early commentators chose to, when they did their work, had to establish the text first. Okay. So I wanted to talk about the death and resurrection of Jesus. Mainline historians would accept this. They'd accept it on grounds of multiple attestation, even from within the Bible itself, having the New Testament having between 5 to 7 different sources in it, testifying to it, to sources like Josephus, Tacitus, and there's a couple others, but I can't remember them, but about that many. And so they are saying that even very sceptical ones who don't accept God at all, that Jesus did die and that his disciples believed this about him. They don't believe it themselves, but they would say that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. How do you respond to that?
Well, first of all, in terms of Josephus, for those of you that don't know, Josephus Flavius was a Jewish historian. And in one of the versions of his history that have come down to us, I think the earliest, manuscript of it is, again, about 400 or 500 years after it would have been initially written. Josephus is reported to have written that Jesus, the Christ, was crucified under Pontius Pilate. Well, if Josephus believed that Jesus was the Christ, or the Messiah, for those of you that don't know, Christos corresponds to Mashiach, or Messiah in Hebrew, why did he remain a Jew his whole life? So, I'd question the validity of that source, and if then we can question that, well, we can certainly question Tacitus, etc. Tacitus, again, we haven't really got a very early example of any manuscripts of Tacitus or early versions, the history or the annals according to Tacitus. And if we are to sort of say, well, these details of history are in them and therefore they're definitely true, well, then we have to put the manuscripts themselves and also the individuals up to question. And I find it very hard to believe a Jew who remained a Jew would accept that Jesus was the Messiah. Jews for Jesus didn't exist in the 1st and 2nd century CE. In terms of the death and resurrection of Jesus, well, I guess, yeah, for sure, historians would claim, that overall that it's accepted that someone named Jesus, who was probably born in Nazareth, was killed on the cross under Pontius Pilate. Now, we essentially believe that. It says in the Qur'an that it appeared to them that he was crucified, so we believe that. We wouldn't dispute that it appeared that Jesus was crucified from a historical perspective. A very important point to note. The second point on that is that there are many, many historical errors that have been documented in the New Testament. So, for example, the marrying of King Herod Antipas with the census that was supposedly done by Augustus Caesar and the killing of the firstborns and all this sort of stuff, it doesn't quite marry up to even within 5 years of one another, yet the Gospel accounts consider that it all basically happened within 1 week, hence why Joseph travelled to Bethlehem, etc., for the census, and obviously why then the family fled to Egypt because Herod was killing all the newborns and all that sort of stuff. So, these are glaring historical errors in the Gospels. Now, I don't think that necessarily subtracts from the message that's contained within them, but I'm sure that you'll at least agree that they're glaring historical errors that all modern historians, even Christian historians, agree cannot be married up with reality.
Well, just on that point of history, I think you'll find that the Gospel account says that Herod killed all the children 2 years and under. And so there's a 2-year window. It's not 1 week. Now, where was I? I agree with what you're saying about Josephus, but historians take that into account. In other parts of Josephus, he talks about the death of James and just mentions the brother of Jesus who was called Christ. And so I don't think you can just write those sources off. And so it seems to me that you edit all history to fit the Qur'an. Would that be the case?
Look, that's certainly not the case. And I'm a student of history, particularly this period in time. particularly Jewish civilization history. Sorry, I'll just answer this question. I'll actually give you one more because my answers, sorry, are far too long. Yeah, look, I mean, first of all, as I said, in terms of Josephus itself, Josephus was a Jew. I find it incredibly unlikely that Josephus would have considered Jesus to be the Christ and still remain a Jew. Therefore, any other reference to Jesus, James his brother, the rest of his family, whatever happened, can be considered to be highly likely a later addition. Had Josephus had a moment on the road to Damascus and become a Christian, well, then I'd certainly entertain the idea. But otherwise, anything that he says about Jesus really can't be considered as, potentially historical fact. As for, the other issues that you spoke about, and the only one that immediately comes to mind is a little point that you snuck in there before about 2 years. Yeah, sorry, I should say 2 years, not a week. The point that I was making is that these 3 key events cannot be married within 5 years of one another. So whether it's separated by 2 years or a week really makes little difference unless these events were separated by 5 years, as they are in all other independent historical accounts. The fact that they're all contained within the life of Jesus, as per the Gospel account, is highly unlikely. So look, as I said, as Muslims, obviously, we don't dispute that Jesus existed. If we did, we'd be disputing what we believe and what's in the Qur'an. We don't dispute that it appeared to the masses that he was crucified. So therefore, obviously, at least someone would have written down that it appeared that he was crucified. And in terms of whether I marry history to match the Qur'an, that's certainly not the case. I mean, I look at history for what it is, and if something contradicts with the Qur'an, I, as an individual, have a responsibility to deal with that, for my own faith. And in fact, the Qur'an says, in many examples, bring evidence if you're truthful. So, said I'll allow him one more. So, yeah.
I just want to get to the death of Jesus again. In the Qur'an, you're saying that it says that Allah made it appear that Jesus was on the cross. Now, for the Gospel, we believe that it's an eyewitness account of what God was doing in the world, the Spirit-inspired prophetic witness to what God has done in Christ. My question is, why would God deceive people like that? Why make it appear that Jesus was dying on the cross when he wasn't? Like, why give them a fiction and actually to, like you're saying, see, maybe Josephus and Tacitus and all that saw this fictional event that God had made. Why do that?
Well, I'm quite honestly not certain of the range of, exegesis or exegeses that are applied to this, verse or verses in the Qur'an. But, to make an assumption, which I really shouldn't do, but I'm only doing this for the benefit of the audience, to make an assumption, it was all about the fact that the enemies of Jesus, which, looking from a historical perspective, we can certainly say were the Romans and were the Sadducees, because pretty much everything Jesus says corresponds with what the Pharisees even believe today, and the rabbinic Jews, and certainly what Hillel the Elder spoke about 50 years before Jesus. Given that the Sadducees and the Romans were his enemies, and what was the punishment for someone claiming to be the Messiah? Death, from both the Romans and from the Sadducees, because the Sadducees were put in control by the Romans. That's, they were in control of the High Temple, they were in control of Judaism, put in place by the Romans. So obviously they were all about self-preservation. Now, if God had have, say, taken Jesus away to be hidden in a garden or something for a couple of weeks, would they have given up looking for him? No, they wouldn't have. So my brief assumption on that would be that it was purely to deceive the enemies of Jesus. And in fact, we've got examples in the Old Testament and also other examples in the Qur'an in the life of Muhammad, where enemies were deceived, through miraculous intervention by God in order to prevent them from pursuing, religious figures any further. So that would be my brief explanation.
Yep. Okay.